It seems to be pretty much confirmed now by so many different independent sources that the next fantasy Total War game is going to be Warhammer 40k, something I think a lot of players, including myself, will be very interested in. That's a whole different issue that we may come back to later on, but for the historical genre we actually don't know. But let's take a look at the top 3 contenders: Medieval 3, Empire 2 and a World War 1 or other title that we just haven't thought of yet. There's also a possibility, I mean it's a very small possibility at this point, I'd be very surprised, of a Shogun 3, a Rome 3, but I think judging from a lack of audience participation in melee focused games such as Pharaoh for example and Troy, I think it's unlikely and definitely unwise for CA to revisit old melee focused titles such as Rome 3. And as for a Shogun 3, even though Shogun 2 is older than Rome 2, certainly a far better game, far more well received on launch, and is actually still relatively playable today. In fact, most people would look at Shogun 2 as the last great Total War game. And the aesthetics of that game, you know, it came out, I think it was early 2014, maybe a little bit wrong there, but the aesthetics of that game are just incredible. You don't actually need any mods to play Shogun 2, although they do add to the game, and that shows how well made Shogun 2 was, that it could still live up to modern graphics today. And that is also a blessing and a curse. It's a curse because it's a risk for CA to revisit Shogun 2 into a Shogun 3, because any work they did, any features they left out or included or changed from the original game would be immediately compared back to Shogun 2 and would receive backlash, and some of that may be justified, but it's just, I think, a little bit too soon for some people, and that game is a little bit too precious. It may turn out into a Rome 1 comparing to Rome 2, oh why don't we have this, why don't we have that, and it could just be a little bit too risky for them, I think. I'm not saying it would be a bad game, I think it actually be quite a good time period to revisit, but I think it's still too much a precious gem for the community to have it reworked again. But anyway, something different is needed, and the options placed before us, as I mentioned before, we've got Medieval 3, Empire 2 or World War 1. I think those are the top 3 I've seen everywhere, either mentioned or rumoured. So let's just tackle the obvious elephant in the room before we tackle the other 2. The wild card, I should say, a Total War set in World War 1. Now, I did a whole video on this explaining why it's bad, you can watch it right here, but I'll just give you a quick summary and why in my opinion this is the wrong move. And if they genuinely go for World War 1, I really hope they pull it off, but under the current format of how Total War works, it's just, for me at least, I can't see how they do it. World War 1 is a very individual combatant centered war. So for example, at the start of a conflict, units would, I'm talking historically now, not in a game sense, units would march in formation. You had German units that were massacred by machine guns right at the start of the war. When the Americans joined, they were still using line tactics. We no longer had line battles. We no longer had cavalry charges. It all became very entrenched, didn't it? And those entrenchments developed into 2 opposing entrenchments all the way across Europe, didn't they? That's what the war developed into, and it became, can we break the enemy formation? This doesn't quite fit with Total War and the maneuverability and the options that you may have, and trench warfare is very, very difficult to replicate in game, especially for the Total War style campaign map. And on the battle side, it would require intense micromanagement of units, because the thing is, in mods like the Great War, which are fantastic mods by the way and really push the Napoleon Total War to its limits, infantry attacks, they get scattered very quickly, get bogged down very quickly, and it just wouldn't work with a Total War game, because I don't think units in their current state will be able to fight effectively. I mean, the weapons they were using were so destructive that it became less about how many men you had and how well you were using your equipment. And so that doesn't really fit with a Total War game. It more fits with a sort of a battlefield style game where you really get to use the equipment well. In a World War game, it would just be very, very click and point. If you know what I mean, artillery would take precedent over everything. And then the other option is you micro it down to individual units and you command the soldiers inside your unit, and that's a Total War game. But then, is that really what a Total War game is? How far are we straying from the original format into a more of a Men of War style game? And it can get very sticky, because Total War has the monopoly of being the best at what it does, which is massive scale battles, putting you as a commander of the army and having a campaign map where you can make strategic decisions, but your experience is split between 2 instances. Focusing that down to a single unit, I think, would be more of a role-playing game. I think that would be a mistake, but not necessarily a bad game. But I think it would be a mistake to call that the next historical Total War. So hopefully the rumours that have surfaced last year of a World War I game are not true. If it is true and it comes out and I'm proved wrong, that's great. I would love to be proved wrong, but I'm just worried about it because it doesn't seem to fit. It's like a square going into a circle. It doesn't really seem to fit. It's possible, but it doesn't seem like it's going to work. So that leaves us with the two most requested options for a Total War game that you will see constantly in every comment section, and those are Empire 2 and Medieval 3. So why these two options? Well, in short, they are set in the perfect time period for Total War. To make a Total War game, you have to pick a time period where something significant happens in warfare or in the world in general. So take Empire Total War, for example. At the start of the campaign, the world is just transitioning out past the discovery of gunpowder into the combination of musketry and pikemen, and it's transitioning into line infantry and effective field artillery that we sort of know of the Napoleonic Wars and then further on. So until this point, artillery pieces were mainly used for siege warfare, but they're not very effective on the battlefield until there's about this point where they start to become real killing machines. We're going to have to do a charge on these guys, I think. Gosh, we can't even get up here. What's going on? And it's an invention of like horse-drawn and maneuverable artillery that are able to deploy on a field and then redeploy rather than having, huge teams of people that were having to move these huge bombards or whatever around, and they weren't ever very effective against infantry. More of a morale shaker, but till this point, artillery was never very effective, and now it is. And so you have less melee focus and more range focus at Empire Total War. And of course, Empire Total War as well as the age of discovery. You're discovering all these new resources, a new world, India, trade nodes and all that kind of stuff. Empire Total War, of course, is far from being a perfect game. It's sort of the black horse of the family, if you would say. But a modern take on Empire Total War in the form of Empire 2 could be, mind you, it'd have to be in a new engine. Let's just make that absolutely clear. If it can't run on the Rome Total War 2 redeveloped engine, it could be, if launched correctly, with no pre-order factions. Imagine if they exclude the British like Civilization did, let's leave that there. But it could be conceivably a masterpiece if everything went well. And like Empire 2, Medieval 3 will be set in a very similar time frame, a time of discovery. Instead of expanding the role of the musket like in Empire, we'd actually be discovering it for the first time, transitioning from very, very early sword into knights and then into guns and then into heavy armor and heavy cavalry and that sort of stuff. And of course, guns in this age would be a very, very basic form of weapons, more of a support weapon rather than a frontline unit, so low range, bad accuracy and long reload. But at close range, a mass gun unit could inflict huge damage on a heavily armoured unit, and that's what they were really for. They were used to punch through heavily armoured knights and heavy armoured formations. And as time goes on, obviously they get more powerful, but that's the appeal, isn't it? That's the appeal of the game. You start off with the basics and you work your way through the tech tree, you work your way through and you develop your armies. And there's so many iconic events that happen in a medieval age, and all are subject to this relentless pursuit of ambition and discovery. And that's why the medieval age really appeals to people. So there you have it, the two most requested possibilities for the next Total War game. However, for a long time I reckoned it'll be an Empire 2, but CA had set their eyes on, and it still possibly could be if that's what they chose 2 years ago. It's been a long time since we've had a ranged focused game. For the Samurai, the last time that we've had it, maybe Empire, it depends how you view it. But something happened, didn't it, in February 2025 this year, I think shook the historical gaming community, and if you haven't guessed it already, what I'm going to reference, and that would be Kingdom Come Deliverance 2. You have to appreciate the argument that's been going around the historical Total War, fantasy Total War pages and discussion boards, and that is that fans are no longer interested. New fans, old fans are no longer interested in historical Total War or historical titles, and that CA should be transitioning out of the historical titles into fantasy and other things. And that's indeed what they're doing with 40k, isn't it? And I don't think 40k is a bad idea. I think it's actually quite a good idea. But KCD2 smashed the assumption that people were no longer interested in new historical titles, because only a few weeks after launch, they had sold 2 million copies of the game, and that's incredible. Just take CA's latest release, Total Warfare, or Dynasties, whatever you want to call it. And it's hard to figure out how many they've sold because I've looked on so many websites and everyone says different things. So it's going to be between 100 and 300,000 copies sold over this 2-year lifespan, and that's with it being on sale as well. KCD2 obviously is yet to be on sale because it's just released, Every copy has sold for at least $60 or $80 for the gold edition. Pharaoh started out at 60, didn't it? But after players rioted because it was just a reskin, pretty much a shell of the game before Dynasties. I think Dynasties is a good expansion. CA would eventually obviously release Dynasties essentially for free, but with it being sold at a meager $26 to $30. I mean, I got it on that special sale. I can't remember how exactly it was. And if you had the game already, you got that for free. So essentially, everyone who'd already bought into the game was getting a free expansion. They were really just trying to get the last bit of money out they could. They knew that Dynasties was what the game should have launched as, and they were just trying to, I think, recoup losses at this point. I don't think Pharaoh made any money. I think it lost money. More to the point, CA needs a win, not just for themselves, not just for the publisher Sega, who's breathing down their neck, but for the community, and that's the most important part of this discussion. Because if this historical game is a flop, if it isn't up to standard on launch, if it's buggy, if it's a mess, if it has significant problems, significant features that are just pushing away from what historical Total War was and should be, if it incorporates character-based instead of faction-based, I think that could be a mistake as well, especially for the medieval times when people like to play as a faction and have the special characters. But you know, Pharaoh and Troy very much focused on the characters themselves, units not so much. If this game doesn't launch correctly, if there's always a problem, if it's buggy, if it's basically uncared for, I don't think a lot of historical Total War commentators will stay around, and I think a lot of them will probably leave. That could be a big problem for CA. As of now, which is 2025, late February, CA have announced that they'll be revealing something late 2025, which will probably be when they announce their next historical title, and until then we can only speculate what that is. It's really between these two choices that will be the wise move, right? They could spring something out of the box and be completely random with it, and like they did with Pharaoh a little bit, but it could be one of these two choices, and if it is, which one is it more likely to be? I think 2 months ago I was at Empire 2, as I said before, but nobody expected KCD2 to do so well. In fact, I mean, it's incredible how well it's done for a independent studio. They're not that independent, but they are independent-er. I started to see glimmers of this when I saw independent reviewers such as Luke Stevens gave the game praiseworthy reviews, unrestricted access to the game. He could say whatever he wanted, and he chose to say that he couldn't wait to get back to it, and he's just pacing around his room or something to that effect, waiting for the game to be released. That's really high praises from someone who is very fair-minded, I think, in the game review industry. And when independent reviewers have not been tied down to a contract saying they can't say bad things about a game and then choose to praise it regardless, and this is repeated from reviewer to reviewer to reviewer, people with different sides of the spectrum, maybe some historical, some fantasy, whatever, and they're all still praising the game, it's highly likely that the game will launch and run and play really well, isn't it? And that's exactly what happened to KCD2. But why 2 million copies sold? Because KCD2 is quite a niche game if you think about it, and it follows its predecessor KCD1, even more niche, but it's really loved by its fan base. However, it never really had that wide audience appeal, did it? And the reason that Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 did better than its predecessor on launch was not just down to the widespread marketing or the unrestricted access they gave to reviewers, which is not to be understated. It was down, I think, to the hunger, the desire for a game that wasn't broken, and especially a historical game that wasn't broken. I think people are so hungry for a historical game. That's kind of weird to say, isn't it? A historical RPG if it's not fantasy, a historical RPG that doesn't delve into magic, but a game that focuses on history and makes it interesting and makes it fun and makes it, you know, want you to come back more. That's what people really want. They want to be immersed in something that actually tentatively happened and that has historical lines and things you can draw back to actual historical events. That's what people want, and they were hungry for it. They hadn't got it in Pharaoh, they hadn't got it in all these other games. I mean, Civ 7 didn't even give it to them. I mean, it was very, very arcadey, so arcadey Civ 7. I've never really got into the Civ games at all. And that's fine if that's what you like. I mean, personally, there's loads of players who love Civ 7, but I personally don't play those games. I just don't enjoy that kind of style. But people wanted an historical experience, something they could relive, something they could change, something they could have an impact in, and that's what this game offered. To demonstrate why, I've done this amazingly constructed Venn diagram.
I love Venn diagrams.
As you can see, KCD2 sits right in the middle. It draws from RPG elements, it draws from Skyrim elements, and it draws from other historically based RPGs such as Red Dead or other games such as that. And because it draws so many different communities, it actually boosts the player base. It's getting that huge market share right now. That's why there's so many copies sold. And if Total War could position itself in the middle and grab other market shares from other people because it was such a good game, not because it was trying to, then it could really change things around for C8. And C8, they've got to see this surely. If you can pull players from different parts of the historical gaming community, you can sell a historical game, but it has to be good. KCD2 released with no major flaws, no major bugs. They've just released their first hotfix patch, or second hotfix patch, I think. And it's not fixing anything major, it's just fixing things that were small or insignificant. This doesn't happen by accident, of course. It happened because Warhorse Studios, the developer behind the game, released a fantastic game. And I know I keep repeating myself in different hats, right? But players overall just wanted a game that wasn't broken or released for once. The reason for this video, I think CA must be looking at this and thinking one of two things. If they've chosen either Empire 2 or Medieval 3, they'll be rejoicing right now, because their gamble that players would still be interested in historical titles is hopefully going to pay off. On the other hand, they'll be extremely concerned if they haven't chosen, if they've gone for World War I or if Star Wars or other fantasy title, because they would have chosen again to ignore their historical fan base and listen to the people who said they're no longer interested. And I think it's kind of obvious for us players sitting back here, but from a business perspective, they had to hit the nail on the head this time, because if they don't and it's terrible and it doesn't sell, Sega will pull the plug. I'm pretty sure. I may have to at some point. They can't just keep it going forever. And I really hope they've chosen to stick with a historical fanbase instead of making a Star Wars game. Oh, I really do, because I mean, if they make a Star Wars game and 40k, I mean, it's going to be weird, isn't it, having two games very, very similar in most aspects. And I really hope they haven't just also made another historical half-bake like Pharaoh was, to kind of patch the sinking ship of historical players and give them another excuse to sell them a game that they don't want. You know, I can also add in that half the reason of the success of KCD2 was the customer player confidence in the game, right? Having that player confidence encourages sales, not pre-sales, but sales on the day. And the reason this happens was because Warhorse gave reviewers such as, I'm just going to name him again, Luke Stevens, full access and the ability to tell you up front before the game launched if the game was good or not. A lot of the time, games companies will have you sign a contract where you can't negatively review the game. You can't really leave a review at all, or whether you should buy or not buy. And so every review that's released early access wise almost seems a little bit like a con, you get what I mean? Unless that reviewer or creator says up front, they've allowed me to say whatever I want. And that's why I think a lot of people trusted the fact that all these different reviewers, different creators were saying, this is a fantastic game, I'm going to play it again. Not because they had to, it's because they wanted to. I think that's the reason why, and C8 needs to fully commit to this blueprint. Don't spoil the game story, obviously that's not the point, but you should be allowed to say if you don't like it, right? You're allowed to leave a review before launch, not after. Just imagine for a second, if the Total War creators from all corners of the weird Total War spectrum that we seem to be on were given the ability to review the game openly and honestly, and in this imaginary world, hypothetical, let's use a better word, in this hypothetical situation, all these people from the different sides of the opinion of what makes a Total War game good and what makes it bad, they all came together and gave a relatively positive review of the game, whether it was historical or fantasy, 40k or medieval, whatever it was. Yes, I can't wait to play it again, and by the way, I've been allowed to criticise and tell you the truth. There isn't a risk at the end of the day. If you make a good game, people will review it openly and honestly. If you don't make a good game, you know, it's your own fault, isn't it? And players no longer trust IGN, we no longer trust all these other gaming journalists we don't know, and we don't know being paid by, all that kind of stuff we can leave by the wayside. But what people do trust is people they've formed a relationship with online, right? Like creators that tell them the truth openly and honestly, and don't change their opinion or don't change their position after they get paid for something or whatever. And the reputation that they've built with that person that doesn't bend their moral compass when it comes to leaving an honest review can really boost a game or a product if they leave a good review for it, right? It's like with Top Gear, for example, the old Top Gear. If they reviewed a car and it had glowing reviews, that car would skyrocket in the sales of that vehicle. And if they didn't, then it would just drop out of the bottom. And that's the power that these guys had in Top Gear. And it's because they were honest with people. People will love the honesty. They knew they weren't going to lie to them just because of some contract that they weren't allowed to say. And with time, that's what I hope to establish on this channel. But more importantly, it's all about rebuilding the trust within the Total War community. It's been slashed over the last 10 years. It's been completely demolished in some cases. And at the moment, it's on a knife edge. It really is. C8 really needs to give unrestricted access, just like Warhorse. I hope they can see the benefits of doing it. If you make a good game, people will leave you an honest review. They're not just going to spite you, because then they look stupid when the game comes out and it's really, really good, right? So it's a win-win for both sides, isn't it? At the end of the day, you sell more copies of your game and you make a good profit if you make a good game. Reviewer, if they leave a good review for your good game, they get more views. So I don't really see the problem with that. Is every single Total War YouTuber going to deliberately leave a bad review of your game if you give them unrestricted access? Of course not. I mean, what kind of logic is that? Anyway, I think we've talked enough about all this. Let's hope they get this right, because we don't want another Pharaoh style launch here. We really don't. If you do, I've just seen so many creators say, I'm not going to do this anymore. If they do a bad launch, I'm not going to upload to major creators. The far more dangerous aspect of this as well is that Sega are looking for an excuse to save money right now. And if you have a bad launch, then would they pull the plug? I don't know. But that's a decision that they will have to make if this game is bad. If it's great, fantastic, and you're going to soar in the opinion polls in the community. But if it's terrible, then you're at risk of people abandoning the franchise, abandoning the studio, and also maybe getting pulled down forever. So on that excitingly high note, hope you enjoyed watching, and I hope this next game is going to be fantastic, whatever it's going to be. World War I, Star Wars, just don't make it Star Wars. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like and subscribe. Alright, see you next time.